Hello and welcome everyone to another edition of the GSMC College Football Podcast, brought to you by the GSMC Sports Network. It is Tuesday, April 9th. I am your host, Tommy Brzee, and we have a great show for you today. We are going to start talking about a little bit new transfer portal news. The NCAA is considering changing the transfer portal rules to give kids even more ability to transfer in the future. So I'll break that down for you all. Then we'll get into some spring practice updates. We've gone into spring games a little bit over the last couple of days, but spring practice is still going on all over the country, so we'll get into that. Then Sam Conn Jr. over at The Athletic had a little bit of an article that broke down what a hypothetical Super League would have looked like in 2023, so I want to break that down for you all and give you guys an idea of what we're kind of looking at in hypothetically with this thing. And then I have another Top 10 Tuesday for you all to close this out with the best programs in the country from where I stand. I've seen a lot of people been doing this lately, so I thought I'd give my 2 cents to the conversation. But before we jump in, I do want to remind you all we get tons of questions and comments throughout the show, and the best way for you all to get your questions on the screen and we can have a fun back and forth here, you can ask something that you've been wondering about. You can use the tip and donation link at the bottom of the screen, GSMCPodcast.net. It's a huge help not only to us here at the network, but to you all. You get to see your name and question on the screen. We get to have a fun back and forth and make this a little bit more of an interactive experience for us all. So definitely use that if you would like to drop a question or a comment in the chat here. But let's jump right in because the NCAA just made a new headline around the transfer portal. We know the transfer portal has been a very confusing entity for quite some time now, and it looks like it might just get more confusing. The NCAA is looking to give kids as many transfers as they want with no penalty. Obviously, this is going to be a mixed bag. Nicole Auerbach from The Athletic has been doing great reporting on this and so many other stuff, but has dropped a article a couple of tweets, I think, yesterday talking about this. It looks like it's going to be brought up in the April 17th and 18th meetings that are coming up very, very shortly. And essentially just says they are allowed to transfer as many times as they want and play immediately as long as they are academically eligible. So a lot less hurdles for them to go through. They don't have the second time you transfer, you have to sit out a year rule unless you get a waiver. So definitely a lot more power being given to the players, a lot more ability to bounce around is being given to the players. So I think it's going to be really interesting to see this kind of develop. Obviously, this is not something that would change the transfer portal windows, so you can't transfer during an ongoing season and play for a second team. You can't transfer outside of those windows. At least you can't enter your name in the portal outside those windows. So those things will still stay the same, but definitely a huge change to the college football world and kind of the way that all of this works. This comes only about 4 months after a temporary restraining order from a West Virginia judge issued a temporary restraining order that was converted into a preliminary injunction to stop the NCAA from enforcing the rule to bar kids from transferring multiple times. So this kind of started in West Virginia with a judge essentially saying this is not something that they can enforce. So totally makes sense. It's something that is going to be really hard to argue in a court of law that this is something that should be in place, at least in terms of antitrust laws and, giving kids the amount of free will that they probably deserve, being, professional athletes at this point. So it is a really interesting thing. I think it's going to be really, really weird as this kind of develops. I think it's going to be really interesting to see how all of this kind of changes the college football world. Also, that is not the only thing that is going to be kicked around during this NCAA meeting. It looks like they're going to look towards a little bit change to the NIL rules. This is from Ross Dellinger, who does incredible reporting as well. But it looks like the universities are going to become more involved in the NIL world. It looks like they're going to take a little bit more responsibility over their players' NIL futures and opportunities and things of that nature. So definitely a huge change there, something that is going to just change the way NIL works. Right now it works mostly through collectives and things of that nature where someone outside the university is helping connect these kids um, with companies, with getting them commercial deals, getting them ad deals, whatever it is. So now that is going to be a little bit more inside of the university realm, which is very, very interesting. It's definitely something that will shift the NIL world quite a bit. It's definitely something that I'm not sure everyone is quite prepared for in terms of what it's actually going to look like. I think the people even inside the building at some of these athletic departments have a very loose idea of what the NIL structure would look like within their school walls. But at the end of the day, it's definitely something that I think they'd rather have than, not have the control. Obviously, the collective is tied to the school in a number of ways, but is still a third-party entity that had to be set up by people that had the school's best interests at heart. So having NIL be a little bit more controlled by the schools is, I definitely think, something that people can mostly get on board with. I think there are definitely some sketchy things that could happen, and I'll kind of get into that as we go. But the way I see this is the NCAA is in a position where we've talked about it quite a bit. They're not necessarily garnering the same power that they used to. Now, they're not necessarily losing it, at great length speed or anything like that, but there definitely is a difference of who they are today and who they were 5 years ago or a decade ago. So I think this is something where when you're the NCAA, you're in a position where you're just trying your best to do as many good things as possible at this point. You're trying to keep intact. You're trying to keep a certain level of autonomy over the sport of college football because, as we've talked about on here a lot, a new governing body is definitely something that could be happening, and I'll get to that here in a second. But I think when you look at the NCAA and all of these decisions, especially the transfer portal decision, I think it's a lot of let's do our best to make the players as happy as possible, make them feel they have as much autonomy as possible, and then possibly we're able to keep this, position that we've held for quite some time. So I think this is an interesting decision by the NCAA. I think it's sort of a, throw stuff at the wall and hope something sticks type of approach at this point, just because they're kind of in dire straits in some respects, and especially in the world of college football. So I think they're in kind of an interesting position, and it'll be really interesting to see how all of this works. And I've said this, countless times on this show. I am very much in favor of kids' ability to transfer and kids' ability to take part in NIL how they see fit. I think it's a huge part of the sport. It's super important to the future of the sport and keeping kids, in college as long as possible. We've seen more and more kids decide to forego their NFL experience for that NIL check when they come back to school. So I definitely think this is something that is really important to the sport. It's really important to keep these kids, in the best position as possible. So that means, making sure they can get a little bit of cash every now and then, making sure that if they are unhappy at a certain situation, they can find their way to a situation that might be a better fit. All of this stuff really does matter when you talk about the way that these kids kind of operate in the future of college football and how the college football is going to look 5-10 years down the road. So I think NIL in the transfer portal, we're not doing away with them. I think if that's your desire in the sport and that's the only thing you're holding out hope for, I wouldn't hold out hope too much longer, because NIL is going to be a big part of the sport going forward. In fact, it's going to be some different type of payment, honestly, where NIL is also included, but it's going to be a little bit more streamlined in the future, if you had to ask me. And then you talk about something like the transfer portal. It's obviously something that is very polarizing. It's created quite the conversation around college football for these last couple of years, and it's left a lot of people very upset. We had the incredible Pat Narduzzi press conference after Jordan Addison transferred to USC, talking about the craziness that is the transfer portal, and it definitely has created an interesting relationship, I suppose, with some fans in college football and the way that they interact with it, because if kids are going to bounce around, you can't necessarily create the same bonds you would if they were to be there for 4 years and kind of develop, and you see them every day at practice and all that type of stuff. So I think all this stuff is going to be very vital to the future of college football. Now, the question is, how are you going to use these two things? Because I think we can all agree for the past couple of years, NIL and the transfer portal have been just executed poorly. I think the ideas are great. I think the entities are awesome. The execution of it is just not very good. It's been a little bit all over the place. The transfer portal rules started fairly strict and have only become a little bit more lenient. The NIL rules, the exact same, where at this point they can't really enforce anything if you're the NCAA. So you're kind of in a position where there's going to be a lot of kids either taking advantage of this transfer portal rule or using the NIL within the school type of model, and it's going to create kind of a weird ability where I think players will have a certain amount of power over what their future looks like, but they won't have a certain amount of power over how to kind of wield that and how to handle all of this crazy stuff, because NIL is one of those things that we know there have been a number of recruitments that have gone a little bit sideways because of it, and certain things were promised that were not fulfilled on. So I think there's certain things with this where hopefully if NIL is introduced into the school, it could become a little bit more streamlined, a little bit more above the board, and kind of give us a better idea of what actually is happening in the NIL world. But I do worry that unlimited transfers and not a ton of regulations around NIL will create a world where transfer portal kids in particular, I think, who are looking for a paycheck before they go to the NFL, or looking for a paycheck before they don't go to the NFL, which is a real reality in this sport. So I think there is a little bit of danger within giving kids as much power as they're being given if the entities around them are not in the position to help them the same way, right? So essentially saying there's a difference between giving players the certain amount of power and putting them in the right situations. And now I don't necessarily think these kids are incapable of handling this themselves. They're obviously all have a great head on their shoulders and are handling things that a lot of us couldn't even imagine handling. But at the end of the day, there is going to be a number of kids who take advantage of this transfer portal rule and do it for the wrong reasons, and do it because something was promised to them that doesn't really exist, or it has they have no indication of actually helping with. So it's going to be really interesting to see kind of all of this unfold. I think the NCAA is losing power by the day, and you need a new governing body as soon as possible. And it's not necessarily to say the NCAA has not, done their best to try to keep up with the sport and, mitigate some of the issues that we've been having, but it's just impossible for them to keep up with this, along with all the other sports that are changing every single day. So I think, people around college football have been talking about it for what feels like probably a decade, to be totally honest with you, but a new governing body for just college football is the most important thing on the table right now. I've believed that for quite some time, and nothing has been done about it, just because the NCAA is still in a position of a certain amount of power right now. And I think it's definitely an interesting thing where if you add a governing body to college football, what happens to the rest of these sports? Are they under the NCAA umbrella? Are they looking for new governing bodies? There's a lot of moving parts here. So I fully understand that this is something that can't happen overnight by any means, but it does need to happen fairly quickly. It's a reason that I think the Super League has some type of legs, because there is this idea that there is this idea around college football, like I just talked about, that we need new governing bodies. We need new people in positions of power, and if we don't have them very, very soon, we're going to have a big problem. So I think there's this energy where we're looking for a lot of answers, and something like the Super League, which I've talked about, I don't think is something to worry about, at least in the short term, but people are looking for answers, and the longer this gets kicked down the road, I think the more the Super League becomes a little bit more of a viable option. So The NCAA obviously has created kind of an interesting world for themselves, and a lot of different things have been discussed and passed over the last couple of years. When you talk about transfer portal and NIL, these might be the two most impactful in terms of the way that it kind of defines these two entities in the sport. And I talked about it before. I love the entities. I think the transfer portal and NIL are super important to what college football is going to be going down the road. But at the end of the day, the execution has just been really bad overall. And I think a new governing body is very important to make sure that not only are these rules enforceable, but they keep the kids in a position to succeed. Because that should be the ultimate goal with these two things. They're very confusing entities that a lot of adults in the room don't understand. And when you hand it with no bars to an 18-year-old, they're going to use it. And sometimes irresponsibly. So I think there's a lot of talk around this stuff. It's definitely something that will update you on once they do vote on this in the 17th and the 18th. But at the end of the day, I think this is something that we've talked about a lot on here, which is giving players a ton of power doesn't necessarily mean giving players, a certain level of happiness and a certain level of peace of mind and putting them in the best position to succeed. So I think this is a very confusing conversation. We will definitely continue talking about it, but for the time being, we are going to take our first break here. And when we come back, we're going to talk about spring practice. We got into some spring games yesterday, but spring practices are still happening all over the country. We are going to bop around the U.S. all over the place, to be totally honest with you. And we will break down all of the updates from spring practice right after this, so stick with us.